4:12 a.m. The South China Sea. Total darkness. A moonless sky pressed down on black water, and the only light visible for 50 miles in any direction was the faint phosphorescent churn of fast-moving wakes cutting south toward Pratas Island. They came without warning, or so Beijing believed. 47 Chinese Type 726 landing craft, each carrying a full complement of People's Liberation Army Marine Corps assault troops, thundered across the South China Sea in tight formation. Above them, a canopy of J-16 fighter jets orbited at 30,000 feet, providing air cover. Behind them, 3 Type 055 guided missile destroyers and 2 Type 052D destroyers formed a surface picket line designed to intercept any response before it could reach the island. Ahead of them, 2 PLA submarines, a Type 093A and a Type 039B, ran submerged and silent, tasked with killing any U.S. naval vessel that dared approach Pratas Island, a flat coral atoll barely 3 kilometers across, sitting at the northern edge of the South China Sea, 250 miles southeast of Hong Kong. It was Taiwanese-administered, a small Coast Guard detachment and a weather monitoring station. No heavy weapons, no missile systems, no armor. A handful of Coast Guardsmen and technicians who never expected to find themselves at the center of the most audacious military operation the People's Liberation Army had ever attempted. But Pratas was not merely symbolic. It sat astride one of the most strategically critical maritime corridors on Earth, the primary transit route for over $5 trillion in annual shipping, the gateway between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the choke point through which a significant portion of the world's oil, electronics, and commerce flowed every single day. For Beijing, Pratas was a stepping stone. Seize it, fortify it, build a runway, install radar arrays and anti-ship missile batteries. And suddenly, the entire northern South China Sea was within Chinese integrated air defense and anti-access coverage. It was a move that had been anticipated by U.S. Pacific command planners for years. It was a move that had been war-gamed dozens of times, rehearsed at every command level, and prepared for with extraordinary operational care. The PLA did not know this, and that ignorance would cost them everything. In the operations center in Beijing, a general watched the live feed from a reconnaissance satellite as the landing craft closed the final miles toward Pratas. The plan had been in development for 2 years. Intelligence assessments confirmed that the nearest U.S. carrier strike group, USS Ronald Reagan, was operating over 400 miles to the northeast, responding to a separate PLA exercise designed specifically to draw American attention away from the South China Sea. Taiwan's Air Force was 45 minutes away at minimum. The window was calculated at 90 minutes. 90 minutes to land, secure, and fortify the island before any credible response could arrive. The general leaned back in his chair. In 90 minutes, the South China Sea equation would change forever. China would have a fait accompli. The world would adjust. He had made 5 catastrophic mistakes. First mistake: USS Ronald Reagan was not where Chinese intelligence believed it to be. The PLA's satellite reconnaissance had been fed false positional data for 72 hours by a coordinated U.S. deception operation. The Reagan strike group was not 400 miles to the northeast. It was 180 miles due west of Pratas, running under emissions control, every radar and radio transmitter silent, moving at 28 knots through the darkness. Second mistake: the submarines were already identified and tracked. The Type 093A and the Type 039B had been under continuous acoustic surveillance for 9 days. USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class attack submarine, one of the quietest and most lethal submarines ever built, had been trailing the Type 093A since it left Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island. USS North Carolina, a Virginia-class boat, had the Type 039B boxed in a passive sonar trap 30 miles south of Pratas. Both Chinese submarines were already in the targeting solutions of American torpedoes. They simply did not know it. Third mistake. The air was not China's. The PLA's J-16 Combat Air Patrol was operating under the assumption that they owned the airspace. They did not detect, because they could not detect, the 6 F-35C Lightning IIs from Reagan's air wing that had been flying in complete electromagnetic silence at the edge of the J-16's radar coverage for 2 hours. The F-35Cs were already inside missile range of every Chinese aircraft in the operational area. They were waiting for one word. Fourth mistake. The surface group's electronic picture was blind on one side. The 3 Type 055 destroyers and 2 Type 052Ds were maintaining a radar picket line oriented northeast, toward where they believed Reagan was located. Their sensors were looking the wrong direction. They had no persistent coverage of the western sector. USS Antietam, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and USS Howard, an Arleigh Burke destroyer, were already inside the Type 055S radar horizon, running dark, positioned precisely in the blind spot that U.S. electronic intelligence had identified weeks earlier. Fifth mistake. They underestimated the speed of American decision-making. In Beijing, the general assumed that even if Washington detected the operation early, the political process of authorizing a military response would consume hours. Consultations, debates, lawyers. He had studied American bureaucracy and concluded it was the greatest strategic asset China possessed. He was wrong. The President of the United States had pre-authorized a full defensive response under existing standing rules of engagement the moment Chinese landing craft left their bases. There was no delay. There was no consultation. The order was already given. The machine was already moving. What happened in the next 31 minutes ended the operation before a single Chinese boot touched the beach. At 4:12 a.m., the first Chinese landing craft was 5 miles from Pratas Island. In the Reagan's Combat Information Center, the strike group commander gave a single order. 6 words: execute. All stations, weapons free. The F-35Cs engaged first. 6 jets, running in total silence, each carrying 6 AIM-120D AMRAAMs, lit their targeting systems simultaneously and began missile release sequences against the J-16 Combat Air Patrol. 12 missiles left 6 aircraft in under 10 seconds. The J-16 pilots had 0 warning. Their threat receivers were silent until the very last second, because the F-35C's low observable design kept its radar cross-section below detection threshold until it was far too late to evade. 4 J-16S were destroyed in the first salvo. 2 more were hit and damaged, breaking formation and fleeing north. The remaining J-16S, suddenly aware they were in a fight they hadn't anticipated, turned their radars on and immediately activated every U.S. targeting system in the area. USS Antietam responded to the J-16 radar activation within 9 seconds. Her AN/SPY-1 radar illuminated the entire battle space. SM-6 missiles began launching from her forward VLS cells, reaching out at the Chinese surface group at supersonic speed. The Type 055 destroyers, suddenly aware that an American cruiser was on their western flank, began launching HHQ-9B surface-to-air missiles and sounding general quarters. It was too late. The first SM-6 impacted the lead Type 055's phased array radar mast, shredding it. The second impacted the ship's bridge superstructure. The third targeted the second Type 055's VLS forward magazine and detonated it in a catastrophic secondary explosion that lit up the South China Sea like a false dawn. USS Howard engaged the remaining surface ships with naval strike missiles, the over-the-horizon anti-ship weapons that the U.S. Navy had quietly integrated into its destroyer arsenal. 4 NSMs were launched in a ripple sequence, staying low, fast, and lethal over the water. 1 impacted a Type 052D amidships. Another hit the third Type 055, tearing open her engine room. Both ships lost propulsion immediately and began taking on water. Beneath the surface, the situation for China's submarine force was equally catastrophic. USS Connecticut had been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment the surface battle began. The moment Chinese sonar operators were distracted by the catastrophic noise and chaos of burning destroyers above them. The moment their commanding officers were receiving emergency radio traffic and conflicting orders from the surface group. The Seawolf-class boat fired 2 Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes at the Type 093A. The Mark 48 ADCAP is the most advanced heavyweight torpedo in the U.S. Navy arsenal. Wire-guided, with active and passive acoustic homing, capable of speeds exceeding 55 knots. At the engagement range that USS Connecticut had chosen, carefully, patiently, over 9 days of trailing, there was no realistic possibility of a miss. The Chinese boat had no time to maneuver. The first torpedo impacted the pressure hull at the engine room. The second impacted amidships, precisely where U.S. intelligence had assessed the boat's most critical internal systems to be located. The Type 093A broke in two and sank in 300 meters of water. Her crew did not survive. USS North Carolina fired on the Type 039B simultaneously. 1 Mark 48 was enough. The torpedo's guidance system tracked the Type 039B's acoustic signature through its evasive maneuver, made a final course correction, and detonated against the submarine's bow section. The Type 039B sank within 8 minutes. 2 Chinese submarines entered the South China Sea that night. 0 returned. On the surface, the landing craft convoy was now without air cover, without a submarine screen, and watching the burning wreckage of its destroyer escort on the horizon ahead of it. The Chinese convoy commander, aboard the lead landing craft, received no coherent communications from the surface group. His radio channels were overwhelmed with emergency traffic, distress signals, and electronic jamming from EA-18G growlers that had launched from Reagan's deck minutes earlier. He ordered a halt. He ordered the convoy to reverse course. He was too slow. USS Ronald Reagan had turned into the wind at 4:19 a.m. and begun launching a full strike package. The flight deck of a Nimitz-class carrier at night during combat operations is one of the most intense human environments on Earth. A choreography of jet blast, roaring engines, arresting cables, catapult steam, and colored jersey crews moving in practiced patterns across a heaving deck in total darkness. On this night, the choreography was perfect. 8FA-18, Super Hornets armed with AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and AGM-154 JSOW glide weapons left the flight deck in rapid succession. Each aircraft shot off the bow catapults at intervals of less than 60 seconds. They formed up at low altitude, flying beneath Chinese radar coverage, and descended on the landing craft convoy from the west. The Harpoon is a 40-year-old weapon, in the hands of a trained naval aviator, flying at night against a convoy of slow, flat-bottomed landing craft with no air cover and minimal self-defense capability. It is as close to a guaranteed kill as naval aviation produces. The first 4 Super Hornets rippled off 8 Harpoons in a single pass. 8 landing craft were hit. 8 landing craft either sank immediately or were stopped dead in the water, burning. The remaining Super Hornets followed with JSOW glide weapons, which separated into submunitions over the convoy's center mass. 3 more landing craft were disabled. The convoy, which had departed Chinese bases in tight, confident formation, was now a burning, scattered debris field 40 miles north of Pratas Island. At 4:33 a.m., a P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft that had been loitering at altitude over the northern South China Sea confirmed the battle damage assessment via its imaging sensors and transmitted it to 5th Fleet, Pacific Fleet, and the National Military Command Center simultaneously. At 4:41 a.m., USS Ronald Reagan's watch officer confirmed that no Chinese military asset was within 40 miles of Pratas Island and closing. The attack had been stopped. The island was safe. The full accounting completed by dawn. 2 PLA Navy submarines destroyed. All hands lost. 3 Type 055 and Type 052. D destroyers, a mission killed. 1 sunk. 2 dead in the water and burning, subsequently scuttled by their own crews before dawn. 22 of 47 landing craft sunk or destroyed. 9 additional landing craft damaged and unable to make way. 11 J-16 fighter jets destroyed or forced to abort. Total PLA Marine Corps assault troops who reached Pratas Island, 0. Total Taiwanese Coast Guardsmen killed in the operation, 0. Total American casualties, 0. Pratas Island remained Taiwanese. The South China Sea remained international waters, and the most carefully constructed operational plan the PLA had ever assembled against a U.S. Allied position had been dismantled in under 31 minutes, not by luck, not by proximity, but by the result of years of intelligence, preparation, positioning, and the cold execution of a military machine that had been built, trained, and stationed precisely for this moment. In Beijing, the general who had leaned back in his chair with confidence at 4 a.m. was no longer in the operations center by 5 a.m. The satellite feed that had shown 47 landing craft steaming toward destiny now showed burning wreckage on a dark sea, scattered across a 20-mile debris field. Search and rescue assets had been scrambled from Hainan Island, but the distances were vast. The night was dark, and the South China Sea is not a forgiving body of water. The great fait accompli, the operation that was supposed to redraw the map of the South China Sea before Washington could react, had ended before the sun rose, before a single Chinese Marine set foot on the island, before the first concrete plan for a runway extension ever left a briefing room and became steel and gravel on contested soil. The United States Navy's 7th Fleet issued no press release. The White House issued a brief statement confirming that U.S. forces had responded to a PLA Navy action threatening a U.S. allies-administered territory and had successfully neutralized the threat. The statement was measured, precise, and contained one sentence that needed no elaboration. All U.S. personnel and Allied personnel are safe. In Taipei, the Ministry of National Defense confirmed that Pratas Island remained under Taiwanese administration. No further comment was made. None was necessary. On Pratas Island, as the sky began to lighten in the east, the small Taiwanese Coast Guard detachment stood outside their station and watched the distant glow of burning ships on the horizon. They had heard the distant thunder of explosions. They had monitored fragmentary radio traffic. They had understood enough to know what had happened. One of them pulled out a radio and transmitted a single message back to Taipei. 3 words in Mandarin. The message translated simply, "We are here." They were. They remained. Because 31 minutes of American military precision had ensured it. The USS Ronald Reagan recovered her last aircraft at 6:02 a.m. and resumed her operational patrol. The Seawolf and Virginia submarines descended to depth and continued their silent watch beneath the South China Sea, as they had before the battle, and as they would after it, for as long as the mission required. The EA-18G Growlers landed, were refueled and rearmed within the hour. The F-35Cs that had killed 11 Chinese aircraft returned to the carrier, were inspected by maintenance crews, and were turned around before 7 a.m. The machine reset itself, as it always does, completely, efficiently, without ceremony and without wasted motion. There was no celebration on the flight deck, no speeches. The watch changed. New operators took their seats at new consoles. The radar returns of the South China Sea scrolled across new screens. The vigil continued. Somewhere in the Western Pacific, a new watch began. new operators at new consoles, new radar returns on new screens, new contacts being tracked, assessed, and filed. The vigil that never ends, maintained by the men and women who never sleep so that others can. This is what happens when you attempt to seize what does not belong to you in waters that the United States Navy has patrolled for 70 years. You do not find a distracted adversary. You do not find a military bogged down in politics and hesitation. You find submarines that have been tracking your boats for 9 days. You find fighters that were already in position before your landing craft left port. You find a strike group running dark and fast toward your position while your satellites show you somewhere else entirely. You find a machine of such depth, such redundancy, such lethality that your plan, your submarines, your destroyers, and your air cover are all gone before the sun rises on the day you chose to make your move. The South China Sea is not China's sea. It is not America's sea. It is a waterway that belongs to free navigation, to international law, and to the nations that border it. And on this night, at 4:12 a.m. in total darkness, on a moonless and unforgiving ocean, the United States Navy reminded the world of exactly that. 31 minutes. That was all it took. 31 minutes to end 18 months of PLA planning. 31 minutes to stop a fleet. 31 minutes to prove once again that the most dangerous assumption any adversary can make is the assumption that America is not ready. America is always ready.